Hello everyone! In this lesson, we are going to continue working on our live search results JavaScript. Okay, so the first thing that I want to work on is if someone opens up the search overlay, and after they type something in and then pause for a second or two, instead of waiting 2,000 milliseconds to output this test message to the console, instead, why don't we practice outputting real HTML content into this area of the overlay, right? Because that's where we want the real search results to be displayed. Now, before we worry about JavaScript, why don't we first make sure that we have an empty HTML div that's positioned to sit right about here. So in order to edit the HTML for the search overlay, let's jump into our text editor and open up footer.php. And down at the very bottom of this file, remember we added this search overlay div. Okay, now right below this inner search overlay top div, so right below this but still within the overall search overlay outer div, let's drop down and create a brand new div and give it a class of container. And then within this div, let's create another div and give it an ID of search overlay __ results. The name doesn't matter, I'm just making this up so that it's something unique we can target in our JavaScript. For now, just as a quick test, if you type hello 123 and go and refresh the page, and there we see it. Cool, so let's delete that hello test message from the HTML so that this div is completely empty. And instead, let's use JavaScript to add content to this div after the 2,000 millisecond delay has passed. So right now, let's jump into our JavaScript folder and then modules and into the search.js file. And let's begin by creating a new property in our constructor that selects that new empty div that we just created. So in the constructor function, maybe at the very top of it, we can just say this dot, and then we can make up whatever name we want. I'm going to call it results div and set it to equal, so $ parentheses to use jQuery. And then for the selector, we use hashtag to select by the ID. And remember, we gave it an ID of search overlay __ results. Okay, now next, let's scroll down to our typing logic method. Remember, this is where we created the set timeout or timer that's going to wait 2,000 milliseconds after a keystroke before running this code, right? This is what's logging out to the console. This is a timeout test. So now, instead of logging out a message to the console, we want to output content into that empty results div. So we could write code right within this anonymous function to add content to that div, right? We could delete this console.log line. But in the name of staying organized and writing clean code, instead of using an anonymous inline function like this, why don't we delete that? Remember, set timeout takes two arguments. The first is a function that you want to run, and then how long you want to wait. So instead of spelling out the function right in place here, why don't we create a brand new method right below this? And let's name this new method getResults, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and then let's tell our timeout to call that method once the time has passed. So for the first argument, we can just say this dot getResults. And then while we're at it, why don't we tack on dot bind this so that we can access our object's properties and methods from within the getResults method. Now, a bit later on, within this method is where we will actually make a request to the WordPress server. But for now, let's just try to output some sample text into that empty results div. So remember, we can access that empty div with this new property we created up in the constructor. The name is results div. So down in our new method, we can say this dot results div, and then we can edit the HTML for that div by using the jQuery method named HTML. And then within the parentheses, let's just say quotes, imagine real search results here. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and test it out. Open up the search overlay, type in a bit of text, and then 2,000 milliseconds later, we see imagine real search results here. So that works, but in my opinion, the user experience is quite bad because there's this big gap in time from when the user starts typing until they finally see some sort of feedback here. So what I propose instead is the millisecond that someone types in even the very first letter, we should display a spinning loader icon animation right here in that empty results div, and then once our getResults method finally runs, this text can replace the spinning loader animation. So let me show you what I mean. Back in our code, within our typing logic method, right above this line where we create the timeout, and right below this clear timeout line, let's add a new line, and let's just target that empty results div, so this dot results div, and let's just set its HTML single quotes, so that way we can use double quotes within the HTML that we want to add. And let's just add an empty div. And the important part, let's give the opening div tag a class of spinner-loader. I've already written the CSS for us that corresponds with this name. So if we go ahead and save this and jump back to the browser, let's open up the search overlay, and as soon as I press even one letter, perfect. So that way, as soon as someone types a letter, they get immediate feedback with that spinner loader icon, but we are still waiting for a pause in their typing to actually create or send off a request, right? Or in this case, display this sample text. So we're sort of getting the best of both worlds. However, you will notice that if I type in something like a full word, you'll notice that after each keystroke, the spinner animation is resetting. Right, so that looks pretty choppy. So what we should do instead is write our code in a way that we only apply this code that adds the spinner div. We only do that if it's not already being displayed. So that way we don't constantly overwrite it on each new keystroke like this. So let me show you what I mean. The way that I would achieve this is up in our constructor function, I'm going to create a new property that keeps track of the state that the spinner is currently in. Now it doesn't matter where in the constructor, but maybe right underneath this line, let's just say this dot, and then we can make up a property name. Let's call it isSpinnerVisible. And by default, let's set it to false. Okay, now down within our typing logic method, remember, this is the line of code we wrote just a moment ago that adds the spinner loader div. So let's just wrap this within an if statement. So I'm going to cut this line into my clipboard. And then in its place, I will say if parentheses, curly brackets. And the condition that I want to check for is if this dot is spinner visible. Only if that is false, meaning if it's not already visible, do I want to make it visible. So you could say if this equals false, but remember, a shorter way of checking if an item is false is you can just place an exclamation mark right before it. Okay, so only if that is false do we want to, and then just paste in your clipboard. Okay, now if this line of code is going to make the spinner visible, then right after that, still within the if statement, we should probably set that property to true. So let's say this dot is spinner visible and just set it to true. Okay, now before we save this, remember that this getResults function, this is what's going to hide the spinner once it's ready. And it's going to override the div with this little bit of text. So in other words, as soon as this line of code runs, then the spinner will no longer be visible. So right after this line of code, let's just say this dot is spinner visible and set it to false. Okay, so this way we are managing that property so we can truly trust its value in this if statement. So let's go ahead and save this and test out typing. So open up the overlay, and if I type in biology, notice that after every keystroke, the spinner icon is not resetting. So it's no longer choppy, and this is now a great experience. And once I stop typing for a second, there we see our Imagine Search Results Here message. However, you might notice that in this text field, if I even use the arrow keys on my keyboard to move my cursor around, that counts as a keystroke that will trigger the loading spinner and also try to send out another search request potentially. And the same is true with the control key or the shift or Windows or command keys. So why don't we change our JavaScript so that if you press a key that doesn't actually change the search string in any way, then there's no need to trigger the loader spinner or do anything at all. Now there are a lot of different ways to code this, but what I'm going to do is up in the constructor function, I'm going to create a property that keeps track of the previous search value. So check this out. Up in the constructor, let's create a new line. Let's create a new property, so this dot, and we could name it whatever we want, but I'm going to call it previous value. And we do not need to set it to equal anything yet. We can just declare it as a property. And then down in our typing logic method, right before this method ends, so down here at the very bottom of this method, let's just update that property. So let's say this dot previous value equals, and then let's just fetch the value of the search field. So we can access our search field by saying this dot search field, because remember we created a property that points towards that element, and then we can just use the val method in jQuery, and that will give us the value. Okay, so this method is going to run after every keystroke, and we aren't updating the previous value property until the very end of this method. So up here at the very beginning of this method, why don't we write an if statement? So if parentheses, curly brackets, and for the condition, let's say only if the current value does not equal the previous value. Only if that's the case do we want to run all of this other code. So for the condition, let's say if the current value, so this dot search field dot val, and val is a function, so it gets its own parentheses. So if that value does not equal the previous value, so this dot previous value. So only if the keystroke that they just pressed actually changed the search string in some way do we want to run any of this code. So now we can just cut and paste or drag and drop this code to live within this if statement. So I'm going to select from clear timeout all the way down to our set timeout line. So basically everything except that previous value line that we wrote just a moment ago. Let's cut that into our clipboard, and then let's just paste it into this if statement. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and test it out in the browser. Open up the search for biology. Okay, and then if I press an arrow key on my keyboard, whoops, we still see the loading icon, so something's going wrong here. Aha, I know what the issue is. So it comes down to key down versus key up. In this case, we want to use key up instead of key down. So let's change this, and then I will explain why. The reason for this is because the key down event fires so immediately after a key press that it doesn't even give the search field a true chance to update its own value. In other words, when this was set to key down and then we were trying to update the previous value property with the current value, the key down event was being fired before the web browser had truly even updated the internal value for that field. So by changing the event to key up instead of key down, the web browser will have enough time, an extra couple of milliseconds, to actually register the input value. Okay, so with this change in place, let's go ahead and save, test it out one more time, open this up, search for a term, and now if I press the arrow key or the shift key or control key or any other key that doesn't actually manipulate the search string, our code is working as intended and it doesn't trigger any changes. Perfect. Now the next thing I want to work on is if someone completely deletes the search string so that the search field is empty, in that case there's no need to show the spinning loader animation. So let me put it back to biology. If someone deletes it so that there's nothing there, I think we should just immediately completely empty out the results div and reset or clear any timeouts that are currently counting down. So that way we don't potentially send a search request to WordPress for literally nothing. So in order to make that change, back in our text editor, if the keystroke in some way changed the search string, in this case hitting the backspace key on your keyboard would indeed do that, then we still want to run the clear timeout, right? Because if someone empties out the search field, we definitely do want to cancel that countdown timer. So we want this line of code to run no matter what, but right below this clear timeout line, let's drop down and write a new line of code. And let's create a new if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets. And for the condition, let's say only if the search field value is not blank. So we can say this dot search field, and then we can get its value or whatever the user has currently typed in by running the val method. And as long as the field is not completely blank, this will evaluate to true. So if that's true, then within the curly brackets, we will do something here very shortly. But if this is false, and if the field is completely blank, we want to do something different. So right after the closing curly brackets for this if statement, we can say else, curly brackets, as a backup plan, do this instead. So if the field is empty and this else code runs, let's just completely empty out the results div. So we can just say this dot results div, and we can change its HTML by running the jQuery method HTML, and then let's just set it to equal an empty pair of quotes. Now after this line of code runs, there's a 0% chance that the spinner loader icon will be visible. So right after that line, let's be sure to set this dot is spinner visible. Let's set it to equal false. Okay, and now before we save this, let's not forget about the do something comment. Instead of that comment, we just want to move this code that we were running before to live where this is. So let's cut and paste or move this. I'm going to begin by selecting from this if statement that checks to see if the spinner icon is currently visible or not. So select that if statement, and then let's also select our set timeout line. So let's cut that into our clipboard. And then up here, let's replace the do something comment by pasting in your clipboard. Let's go ahead and save that and test it out. Let's search for something. And then if I delete or empty the text field, perfect. Our results area is immediately cleared and we don't see an unnecessary loader icon. Now there's only one final remaining thing I want to take care of in this lesson. So if I close the search overlay, we can see that behind the scenes right here, I've temporarily added a test input field. Now this placement doesn't make much sense, but that's not the point. The point is that you're probably going to have a text input or a text area field somewhere else on your website, maybe on a contact us page, for example. And I want to make sure that our search module doesn't negatively affect other inputs. So for example, if I click into this field, I can start typing, right? But if I press the S key, remember that the S key is going to trigger our overlay to open. So that's really awkward and it could be frustrating for users. They think they're typing in a field, but then if they hit the S key, they accidentally open something that they weren't intending. So what I propose here to fix this is if a text area or input field currently has focus, then in that case we do not want the S keystroke to open our overlay. So what we can do back in our code is scroll down to our key press dispatcher method. And remember, this block of code is saying if the key that was just pressed has a key code of 83, which is the S key, and if the overlay is not already open, then open it. So let's just add a third condition. Right here we can say ampersand ampersand, and let's check to see if any text fields on the page are currently focused. So we can use jQuery, and we can select any inputs or comma, any text areas. And then once we've selected those, we can use the jQuery method named is and provide it an argument of quotes, :focus. So if any field is currently focused, this will evaluate to true. But if we want to check for the opposite of that, we can just put an exclamation mark right before it. Okay, and this is the perfect condition check now. All of these stars have to align in order for the overlay to be opened. So let's save this and test it out. If I click onto this text field here and type the S key, nothing happens. But as soon as I click out of that text field and press the S key, there's the overlay. Perfect. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. Now here's the exciting part. In our very next lesson, we are finally going to learn how to actually send a request to the WordPress server or database. Let's keep it rolling, and I will see you then.